90% of all accidents are avoidable. That's what some researchers suggest. Avoidable. Well, I know if you're speeding, you're more likely not only to get a ticket, but to get in trouble. If you run a red light, I know you're more likely to get in an accident. A drunk driver, crossing a double yellow line. There are so many things in our lives that are completely avoidable if we stay in the right lane and go the right speed and obey the laws of the land. And Paul is writing to young Timothy and saying, you know what? You've got to be a good leader. And just because you can do whatever you want in liberty of faith, as Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, you have to be careful and think of others. You have to show leadership. Paul was mentoring young Timothy. He picked him up on his second missionary journey, though he would discover this relationship with this young believer on his very first missionary journey. Timothy would go on and become a leader, and he would serve in several churches like Ephesus, Thessalonica, Corinth, Philippi, and even in Rome. Now, these cities were enormous cities, and they were very immoral cities. They worshiped idols, and they had gods of, well, just immorality. So much pornography and things like temple prostitutes, very common in Thessalonica and Corinth, and even in Ephesus. Well, when people became believers, they brought the ways of the world into the church, and Paul said, you know what? You need to be a good leader. He actually writes to us in the early verses the very purpose of this letter to this young man, Timothy. The purpose of my letter is instruction so that believers would be filled with love that comes from a pure heart, a clear conscience, and genuine faith, that their lives would be healthy, that the house of God would be healthy. And then he lays it out. Some teachers in your ministry aren't good teachers. They're bad teachers. They get into arguments and senseless debates, and they're more concerned about their pedigrees, and they're very self-serving leaders. You don't have those kind of teachers. And worse than that, Hymenaeus and Alexander, he kicked out of the church because they were teaching false doctrine. They were self-serving and leading people down the wrong path, things that God did not say in His Word, and actually undermining the very teachings of Christ and Paul himself. No, you need to be a good leader and have godly teachers that build love and build faith. Oh, there are all kinds of challenges in these big cities, these mega churches that he was leading. But even in the small works that he would say to him, you must have leaders, elders and deacons. And we find that in the book of Acts chapter 6. And now this is 30 years later, and the church is growing, and Paul is saying, when you have a leader, when you have a deacon, when you have an elder, these are the standards, and these are the qualifications. We must have healthy conduct in the house of God. I am writing these things so that you will know how people must conduct themselves in the house of God. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 14. He concludes this letter by saying to young Timothy, you may be young, and I understand that, but don't allow people to look down on you because of your youth. You be an example. You be an example. And something had come into the church that as a believer, you weren't under the law and you had great freedom. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul had said, it may be okay spiritually to do certain things, but don't do them if it causes somebody else to stumble. Always keep the faith and the love of others around you as the priority. And you set the standard, you set the example, you live the life that others might follow you and thus follow Christ in love and in faith. It may be true 90% of all accidents may be avoidable. I don't know that, but I do know this. If we live a righteous life as an example to others, we will lead them in a path to Christ with love and faith. In Jesus' name.